At 11:43 on the night of March 31st, 1922, a 6-year-old girl named Cecilia Gruber woke up in the farmhouse she shared with her family and told her mother she had heard footsteps in the attic. Her mother told her to go back to sleep. By the next morning, every person in that house was dead. The investigation that followed became one of the most exhaustive, most baffling, and ultimately most unsolved cases in German criminal history. Over the course of the next century, more than 100 suspects would be named. At least 50 investigators would work the case at different points in time, some spending years on it, some returning to it after retirement, some picking it up as an academic exercise with fresh methodology and a cold case's worth of distance. The skull of the primary male victim was sent to a psychic, and still, as of today, no one has ever been charged. No arrest, no trial, no conviction. The case is officially open. To understand how a family of 6, plus a woman who had been on the property for less than a day, could be murdered in a remote Bavarian farmhouse without a single surviving witness, without a motive that investigators ever confirmed, and without a killer who was ever formally identified, we need to go back about 3 years earlier, to a farm at the end of a long, muddy track through the fields, to a family whose internal history was, even by the difficult standards of rural Bavarian life in the early 20th century, deeply troubled, and to a location so removed from ordinary village life that the nearest neighbors were nearly a mile away across open farmland. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. The name means roughly the back of the hamlet of Kaifeck, a descriptor that is almost literally accurate because the farm sat at the end of a dirt path that branched off from the road, connecting the small village of Weidhofen to the surrounding countryside, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, in the district that would later become part of Schrobenhausen. In the spring of 1922, that part of Bavaria was a place under pressure from every direction. The First World War had ended less than 4 years earlier. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of territory, imposed reparations that the country could not realistically pay, and left the social fabric of rural communities pulled tight over a frame of economic anxiety. Inflation was already beginning its catastrophic upward climb, the kind of inflation that within 18 months would require a wheelbarrow full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Young men who had gone to the front in 1914 and 1915 had come back from the trenches fundamentally changed, or had not come back at all. Communities that had sent half their working-age men to a war and gotten back a fraction of them were recalibrating everything: labor, inheritance, family structure, the silent agreements that hold a small place together. In this environment, a remote farm with no telephone, no reliable road access in wet weather, and neighbors far enough away that a voice raised in distress would carry nowhere useful, that was not remarkable. That was simply the geography of the Bavarian countryside. The farm belonged to Andreas Gruber, who was 63 years old in the spring of 1922. He had worked that land for the better part of 4 decades. He was described by people who knew him as a big man, physically strong, not easily shaken, the kind of farmer who had built his life through sustained physical labor and who expected the same from everyone around him. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, was 72. She had lived on that farm alongside him through the turn of the century, through the war, through the losses and the hardships that came with both. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was 35 in 1922 and had been widowed when her husband Carl Gabriel died, though the circumstances of his death were themselves complicated and would later attract some investigative attention. Victoria had 2 children living in the farmhouse with her. The elder was a daughter, also named Cecilia, 7 years old, called by neighbors and family by the diminutive Zanzel to distinguish her from her grandmother. The younger was a 2-year-old boy named Joseph, and it was Joseph's existence that had placed the Gruber family at the center of the kind of village talk that in a tight rural community can persist for generations. The rumors about Joseph's parentage had not remained rumors. They had been investigated formally by local authorities. In 1915, both Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria had been convicted of incest by a Bavarian court. The conviction carried a fine rather than imprisonment, but what it carried into the social life of the surrounding villages was something harder to quantify, a permanent stigma, a reason for the kind of avoidance that doesn't require a stated explanation. People in Schrobenhausen and the surrounding hamlets knew the Grubers. They traded with them occasionally. They did not visit socially. The farm at Hinterkaifeck had, over the years, become something that people in the area skirted around in conversation, not ignored exactly, but not engaged with directly either, which made it all the more significant that on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922, a woman named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm to begin work as the family's housekeeper. Maria Baumgartner was 51 years old. She came from a neighboring area and had been placed at Hinterkaifeck through a relative who had made the arrangement. She knew something about the farm's reputation. It was impossible to be a working woman of her age in that part of Bavaria and not have heard, at least, the outline of the Gruber family's history. She may have known that the previous housekeeper had departed in a state of visible distress, reportedly telling anyone who would listen that there was something wrong at that farm, something she could feel but not name, something that had driven her out before her contracted time was up. Whether Maria Baumgartner weighed this information and decided the need for employment outweighed it, or whether she simply believed the previous woman had been prone to dramatics, is not something the record makes clear. What the record does make clear is this: the relative who brought her to Hinterkaifeck watched her carry her bag through the gate, watched the gate close behind her, and drove away. That relative was among the last people alive who saw Maria Baumgartner alive. She had been on the property for perhaps 6 to 8 hours before she was killed. In the weeks before the murders, Andreas Gruber had been telling people that something was wrong on his farm, not in the way a frightened person talks, not openly, not seeking help, but in the blunt, factual way of a man who has noticed an anomaly and is reporting it the way he might report a broken fence or a sick animal. He told a neighbor about footprints he had found in the snow. The prints led from the tree line at the edge of the property to the farmhouse. They did not lead back. Someone had walked out of the forest to the farm. According to the tracks, that person had never left. He mentioned that a newspaper had appeared on the property, a Munich publication that was not delivered to Hinterkaifeck, and that no member of the family had gone to fetch. He said that keys to the house had disappeared and could not be found. He noted that the family's dog, which was not a nervous animal by its nature, had been behaving with unusual agitation, barking at the barn at odd hours, refusing to settle at night. Andreas Gruber was not the kind of man who alarmed easily. The people who knew him were consistent on that point. He was, if anything, the type to dismiss concerns as weakness and to deal with problems by confronting them directly, rather than seeking outside help. But even by those standards, what he was describing in those final weeks was specific enough and persistent enough that at least 2 neighbors later told investigators they had thought something genuine was wrong and had wondered whether to say something more directly to him. Neither did. He did not call the police. He did not make arrangements to have the farm watched. He did not take his family somewhere else while he investigated the problem. He remained, and in the evenings, when the sun dropped behind the fields and the path to the road became invisible in the dark, someone remained with him. The murders were not discovered for 4 days. Sit with that for a moment. 4 days. In a farming community where animals need to be fed on a schedule, where a family with children has a visible presence in the rhythms of daily rural life, church attendance, children at school, the normal traffic of a working farm. The Gruber family was simply absent for 4 days before anyone went to check on them. The mail had collected at the box. 7-year-old Cecilia had not appeared at her school. Neighbors had seen that the chimney at Hinterkaifeck was still producing smoke, which they had taken as evidence that someone was home, and simply, what? Choosing not to interact. Dealing with some private matter? The social distance that had grown up around the Grubers over the years of the incest conviction and the rumors about Josef appears to have been sufficient that even their unexplained disappearance from ordinary life did not trigger an immediate response. That smoke rising from the chimney was not incidental. It would become one of the most discussed details in the entire case, because investigators, working through the evidence later, came to a conclusion that was in some ways more disturbing than the murders themselves. The person or persons who killed the Gruber family did not leave immediately after the killings. They stayed. They fed the cattle. They maintained the farm's daily routines. They kept the fire burning in the house that contained 6 bodies. For somewhere between 2 and 4 days after the murders. The precise timeline has never been established with certainty. Whoever was responsible for those 7 deaths was living at Hinterkaifeck. When a group of neighbors finally made their way to the farm on the afternoon of April 4th, 1922, they found it in a state of surface normalcy that made what was inside more jarring. The entrance to the property looked unremarkable. The outbuildings were in order. It was not until they entered the barn that the reality of what had happened began to emerge. Andreas Gruber was in the barn. So were his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and the 7-year-old girl also named Cecilia. All 4 had been struck with a mattock, a heavy agricultural hand tool, somewhere between a pickaxe and a wide-bladed hoe, the kind of instrument found on virtually every Bavarian farm, and one that would not have required an intruder to bring anything from the outside. The wounds were consistent with a series of blows delivered with considerable force, targeting the head. The pattern of the injuries suggested to the investigators and medical examiners who analyzed them that the victims had been drawn to the barn or lured there, and then attacked from behind or above in a sequence that implied either multiple attackers moving with coordination or a single attacker working with sufficient speed and force to prevent the later victims from escaping after the first fell. Young Cecilia, the 7-year-old Zanzel, had not died instantly. This is one of the details in the case that becomes very difficult to move past and very easy to understand, why it lodged itself in the German public consciousness for the next 100 years. Medical examiners who studied the evidence determined that she had survived for some period after the initial blow. She had been found with her own hair clutched in her fists, gripped tight, pulled from her own head. The interpretation offered by the examining physicians was that she had been conscious long enough after being struck to feel what was happening, to be aware of the darkness and the pain and the sounds around her, and had grabbed at her own head in the involuntary, physical expression of that awareness. She was 7 years old. She had told her mother she heard footsteps, and her mother had told her to go back to sleep, and sometime in the hours that followed, she had died in a barn with her own hair in her hands. The 2-year-old Joseph and the housekeeper, Maria Baumgartner, had not been killed in the barn. They were found inside the house. Joseph was in his cot in the bedroom he shared with family members. Maria Baumgartner was in her room, the housekeeper's quarters, where she had presumably gone to sleep on her first night at a new position. Both had been struck with the same mattock, or an instrument consistent with it. Joseph was 2 years old. He posed no threat to anyone, could identify no one, and represented no conceivable witness risk in any practical sense. His death tells us something about the psychology of whoever was responsible, either an absolute thoroughness that extended to eliminating the smallest possible loose end, or something else, something that goes beyond calculation into territory that is harder to name. The mattock was left at the scene. The killer walked away from the barn, or the house, or both, and left the primary weapon where it had been used. The local constables who arrived first on April 4th recognized within minutes that they were looking at something far beyond what their rural post was equipped to handle. Investigators from Munich were summoned. Within a day or two, multiple officials from the Bavarian State Police and the district prosecutor's office were on site at Hinterkaifeck. But the farm had already been compromised in ways that could not be undone. Neighbors who had gathered after the discovery had walked through the buildings. Objects had been touched. The barn, where 4 of the bodies had been found, had been entered by multiple people before anyone thought to restrict access. In a modern investigation, every person who entered that space before forensic documentation was complete represents a potential contamination of the evidence. In 1922, the science of crime scene preservation as a discipline was barely in its infancy. There were no fingerprint databases operating at a useful scale, no blood typing analysis of the kind that could reliably narrow suspects, no fiber analysis, no ballistics work relevant here, no photographic documentation of the scene made before it was disturbed. What investigators had was a partially contaminated crime scene in a remote location, physical evidence that had been handled by unknown numbers of people in a community that related to the Gruber family, primarily through rumor and deliberate distance. They began with motive. The problem was that the Grubers had several plausible sources of enemies without any single one standing out clearly enough to anchor the investigation. The incest conviction was the most obvious starting point. The scandal had created a public record of conflict between the family and the community around them. There were people in the surrounding villages who had strong feelings about what the conviction represented, moral feelings, social feelings, and in some cases, practical feelings about what the Grubers' presence meant for the reputation of the area. Whether any of those feelings had sharpened into homicidal intent was a different question, and one that the record didn't answer. Victoria's late husband had family. Carl Gabriel had reportedly died during the war, but the circumstances of his death had drawn some quiet questions at the time, and his relatives were not warmly disposed toward the Grubers. Property and inheritance disputes were common in rural Bavaria and could generate grudges of remarkable durability. Andreas Gruber had been in an ongoing dispute with at least one neighboring farmer over the boundary of his land, the kind of slow-burning conflict over meters of field and fencing that in tight agricultural communities could outlast the original parties and become a family-level grievance passed down across generations. And then there were theories that pointed further out. A former prisoner of war, possibly one of the thousands who had been held in camps in the region during the war, and released into an unfamiliar landscape with no resources and no plan. A drifter with no connection to the area who had simply recognized the isolation of the farm and seen vulnerability. A former farmhand who had worked at Hinterkaifeck at some earlier point, left under difficult circumstances and retained the kind of specific knowledge of the property's layout and rhythms that only extended familiarity produces. But none of the external theories adequately accounted for the footprints. The prints in the snow that Andreas Gruber had reported in the weeks before the murders, leading to the farm and not leading away, implied not a passing criminal, but a deliberate one. Someone who had come to Hinterkaifeck with intent and knowledge, who had found a way to remain on or near the property without being detected, and who had spent time observing before acting. Add to this the missing keys, which suggested either a theft of means of access or a strategic removal of the family's ability to lock out an intruder from within. Add the newspaper that appeared without being delivered, which implied someone who had been beyond the farm's immediate perimeter, moving in the broader world, and had for some reason brought a publication back with them. These details, taken together, did not describe an opportunist. They described someone with a plan, with patience, and with a specific reason to want this particular family dead. The investigators who looked hardest at the evidence in the weeks and months after the murders came to a conclusion that was specific and deeply unsettling. Whoever killed the Grubers had been living in or near the farmhouse for a substantial period before the killings took place, not days. The most carefully reasoned estimates suggested weeks, possibly longer. Someone had been in that attic, the attic where 6-year-old Cecilia had heard footsteps on the night she died, learning the routines of the house, understanding who slept where, knowing the layout of the barn and the placement of tools, waiting for a moment that, for reasons the record never makes clear, came on the night of March 31st and not before. The behavior of an opportunistic criminal doesn't explain that level of preparation and patience. The behavior of someone for whom Hinterkaifeck was not a random target, but a specific one, does. The most seriously examined suspect in the immediate aftermath of the discovery was a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He was a neighboring farmer, roughly the same generation as Victoria Gabriel, and his connection to the Gruber family was intimate in ways that gave him both possible motive and possible opportunity. Schlittenbauer had at some point been in a romantic relationship with Victoria. He was widely believed, and had by some accounts tacitly acknowledged, to be the biological father of little Joseph. He had provided some financial support for the child, which in the rural community of the time represented a kind of implicit admission of paternity. He had also had a serious and public falling out with Andreas Gruber over money, specifically over funds that Andreas had reportedly demanded or extracted in connection with the arrangements around Joseph's birth. The falling out was documented in the sense that people in the community knew about it and were willing to speak about it to investigators. What made Schlittenbauer particularly notable was not just the motive, but his behavior on April 4th, the day the bodies were discovered. It was Schlittenbauer who had organized the group of neighbors that went to the farm. It was Schlittenbauer who led them through the gate. It was Schlittenbauer who had moved through the property, the barn, the house, the separate areas where the bodies were found, with a directness that at least one person in the group later described to investigators as striking. He had gone to certain places without hesitation. He had touched certain things. He had, in the recollection of witnesses, not behaved like a man entering an unfamiliar space in a state of shock, but more like a man who knew where to go and went there. None of this was enough. Schlittenbauer had an alibi for the relevant period, not ironclad, not verified, with the precision that a modern investigation would require, but sufficient in combination with the absence of physical evidence directly connecting him to the murders. He was questioned extensively. He was questioned again at later points in the investigation. He denied everything throughout, consistently until his death in 1941. He was never charged. Other suspects accumulated across the decades with the same pattern. Compelling circumstantial cases that fell apart under direct scrutiny. A former farmhand who had worked at Hinterkaifeck years before the murders, and who several researchers identified as having both the knowledge of the property and a documented grievance against Andreas Gruber. Various members of the extended Gabriel family circle, a figure connected to the political violence that was beginning to surge through Bavaria in the early 1920s. The beer hall putsch that would bring Adolf Hitler to brief national prominence was only 18 months away, and the Bavarian countryside in those years was seeded with paramilitary groups, some of them capable of directed violence against specific targets. This last theory has never found strong evidentiary support, but it reflects the desperation of an investigation that has now been running for over a century without resolution. Among the strangest chapters of the case came in 1923, roughly a year after the murders, when authorities decided to exhume the remains of the victims for further examination. The goal was to extract additional information from the physical evidence that had survived, the precise nature of the wounds, the angles of impact that might suggest the height or physical build of the attacker, any detail that earlier examination had missed. The skull of Andreas Gruber was transported to Munich. It was presented to a clairvoyant, a psychic, who had evidently developed a reputation in the city as someone useful in criminal investigations. Investigators asked her to determine the identity of the killer through psychic means. This is worth pausing on, not because it is absurd by our standards, it is, but because it illuminates the desperation of the investigators by 1923. They had questioned dozens of people. They had analyzed the physical evidence with every tool available to them. They had developed theories and watched each one collapse under cross-examination. And now they were sitting in a room in Munich with the skull of a murdered farmer, hoping that someone with claimed supernatural ability could tell them what rational investigation had failed to produce. The psychic examined the skull. She provided a name and a description of the killer. The name was followed up. It led nowhere. The description matched no known suspect. The skulls, not just Andreas's, but several of the victims, were retained by Bavarian state authorities for continued examination. At some point in the mid-20th century, they disappeared. No record exists of when they were lost, where they went, or how. A set of human skulls from one of the most discussed criminal cases in German history simply ceased to be in the custody of the state at some point between their exhumation and the present day. They have never been recovered. It is the kind of detail that, in any other context, would be dismissed as too implausible to be accurate. In the Hinterkaifeck case, it is simply one more thing that cannot be explained. The decades after World War II saw the case taken up repeatedly by a new generation of investigators, journalists, and academic criminologists who approached it with different methodologies and the benefit of comparative research into similar cases. Each new analysis brought a renewed focus on the existing suspect pool. Schlittenbauer remained the name that came up most persistently, followed by the former farmhand theory, but also introduced frameworks drawn from forensic psychology that hadn't existed in 1922. In 2007, a police training academy in Bavaria used Hinterkaifeck as a teaching exercise. A full cohort of trainees was given the complete available evidence, the original investigation files, the exhumation reports, the witness statements, the maps of the property, everything that had been assembled over 85 years of on and off investigation, and asked to approach the case as if it were new. They worked on it for months. They applied modern profiling techniques to the behavioral evidence. The pre-crime surveillance implied by the footprints and the missing keys, the post-crime behavior of remaining at the scene and maintaining the farm's routines, the specific targeting of every person on the property, including a toddler. Their conclusion was that the perpetrator was almost certainly someone within the close social circle of the Gruber family, someone with detailed knowledge of the farm, a personal grievance significant enough to sustain the planning and patience the crime required, and the physical capability to carry out multiple killings in sequence. They produced a psychological profile. They did not produce a name that could be advanced to the level of probable cause. Even with modern training and fresh eyes, the 85-year-old evidence could not be pushed across the threshold. The question that has preoccupied investigators and researchers more than any other in the years since is not who killed the Grubers. It is why the killer stayed. Think about what that behavior means in practical terms. After killing 6 people, 4 in the barn, 2 in the house, a person chose not to leave. They chose to remain on a property with those bodies. They fed cattle that needed feeding. They maintained the fire in the hearth. They slept somewhere on those grounds or in that house for multiple nights. They did not panic. They did not flee. They waited with apparent calm for several days before whatever internal or external logic finally brought them to the point of departure. Forensic psychologists who have reviewed the available evidence in later years have been consistent on one point. This behavior does not match the profile of an opportunistic criminal who encountered a vulnerable target and acted. It matches the profile of someone for whom that farm represented something: ownership, grievance, attachment, a claim of some kind that was not resolved by the killings themselves and required a period of presence to work through. The staying was not purely tactical in the assessment of most researchers who have examined it. It was psychological. It was personal. It was the behavior of someone who, even after the most extreme possible act, could not immediately walk away. That observation, had it been applied to the suspect pool in 1922, with the weight it deserves, might have narrowed the investigation considerably. Someone who could not walk away from Hinterkaifeck, even after 7 murders, is not a stranger to that place. They are not a drifter or a transient criminal or a political actor with no personal stake in the farm's particular geography and history. They are someone for whom that place and those people meant something specific and lasting. The number of people who fit that description in the social world of rural Bavaria in 1922 was not large. By the centenary of the murders in March of 2022, the case had accumulated around itself a substantial cultural weight. Multiple books, in German and in translation, a German film adaptation, podcast episodes in several languages, academic papers in criminology and forensic psychology journals. Bavarian archivists had by that point made significant portions of the original investigation file available to researchers, and the documents were studied with the same attention that scholars give to primary historical sources, because that is, in the end, what they had become. The evidence was as complete as it was ever going to be. The witnesses were all dead. The suspected perpetrators were all dead. The scientific tools that might have resolved ambiguities in the physical evidence, DNA analysis, advanced wound pattern matching, digital reconstruction of the crime scene from the original descriptions, could be applied in theory, but the actual physical evidence available for that kind of analysis was limited. The skulls were gone. The mattock had not been preserved. What remained was paper, investigation records, court documents, newspaper accounts, the statements of neighbors and witnesses recorded in 1922 and 1923 by investigators who had not anticipated that those statements would still be the primary source material 100 years later. The mattock was never traced to a specific owner. The footprints in the snow were photographed, but never matched to a shoe or a boot belonging to any suspect. The missing keys never reappeared. The newspaper that had arrived at Hinterkaifeck without being delivered, its origin, the question of who brought it and from where, was never answered. In a case that has received more sustained investigative and analytical attention than almost any other unsolved murder in German history, those small specific unanswered questions persist with a stubborn clarity that is almost as striking as the central mystery. Some cases go unsolved because the evidence was never there to begin with, because a crime was committed with such care and such absence of witnesses that there was simply nothing to work with. Hinterkaifeck is not that kind of case. The evidence existed. The crime scene contained information. The community contained people who had heard the rumors about the farm in the weeks before the murders, who had perhaps registered something without understanding what they were registering. The case is unsolved for a different set of reasons. An initial investigation that was compromised before it truly began, in the first hours of April 4th, when neighbors walked through a barn and touched things and broke whatever chain of physical evidence had survived the murders themselves. Scientific tools that were decades away from existing, and perhaps most significantly, a killer or killers who understood that remote location, understood how the Grubers' social isolation worked in their favor, and had the psychological composition to remain calm through days of sustained proximity to what they had done. The farm buildings at Hinterkaifeck were demolished in the years following the murders. The property was eventually absorbed into the surrounding agricultural land. Where the barn stood, where the farmhouse stood, where a family of 6 went about the routines of late winter farm life In the final days of March 1922, there is now open field. The path that led to the farm from the road has been reclaimed. There is a small memorial at the site, a cross and a stone marker, set modestly at the edge of the field in a way that could be easily overlooked if you didn't know to look for it. In late March, which is the time of year that matters here, the ground at that latitude in Bavaria can still be iron hard in the mornings, frost-locked, the fields pale, and the trees at the field's edge standing bare against a sky that offers light without warmth. It is the kind of landscape where, 100 years ago, a set of footprints in the snow could lead to a farmhouse and not lead back. There are no answers at the memorial. There are the names, carved in stone, of the people who were there when the answers were made and lost. Andreas Gruber, Cecilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, Cecilia Gabriel, Josef Gabriel, Maria Baumgartner. 7 names, 1 case. 100 years of investigators working through the same documents, arriving at the same threshold, and finding that the door does not open. If the shape of this case, the way it refuses to close, the way each answer generates a new uncertainty, the way a killer's patience outlasted an investigation's ability to reach them, stays with you the way it has stayed with criminologists and historians for a century, there is another case on this channel with a similar architecture, a crime that was witnessed, documented, examined from every angle, and still never fully explained. It is waiting for you next.